Hello and welcome to today's webinar, How to Kill the Fax Machine in 6 Steps. Thank you for joining us, and before we get started, I want to take a moment to go over a few administrative details. As you have noticed upon joining the webinar, everyone has been placed on mute for the presentation. At the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. In your GoToMeeting control panel, you will see a questions box. Please type your questions or comments into the field and hit enter. Please note that the recording of this webinar, along with the slide deck, will be posted to the WEDI website, and downloading instructions will be emailed to all registrants following the live webinar. Now, here we'd like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. We have Allison is a product owner in Avality's clinical data area, where she is responsible for clinical data integrations, operations, and provider payer initiatives. Avality is tackling the challenge health plans and providers face when sharing clinical data with offerings designed to reduce manual processes, including HL7 messages, medical records, automated authorizations, risk and quality applications, and primary care notifications. Allison began her career in healthcare as an intraoperative neuromonitoring clinician, working in hospital and outpatient operating rooms across the country. She primarily worked with neuro, orthopedic, and cardiovascular surgeons to ensure patients' neurological integrity was maintained during operative procedures. Prior to joining Avality, Allison worked for a surgical software and device company providing on-site clinical and technical support to the doctors and staff of the Lyerly Neurosurgeon Group at Baptist Medical Center in Jacksonville, Florida. Allison earned her Bachelor of Science degree with a concentration in brain behavior and cognitive science from the University of Michigan. She also holds a Master of Healthcare Administration degree from the University of Florida. We also have Linda here. Linda is a product line manager for Avality's provider business, where she is responsible for planning and executing the Avality RCM roadmap. Prior to this role, she served as Director of Provider Services Operations, and before that, she was Director of RCM Client Experience. Linda began her career at Avality in 2004 as a client account manager. Before joining Avality, Linda managed back office operations for several provider offices, where she was responsible for coding, AR collections, authorizations, referrals, payment posting, and the check-in and check-out processes. She also managed a practice management conversion. Linda gained clinical experience as a hospital corpsman in the U.S. Navy. Linda received her Bachelor of Science in Business Administration with a major in finance from University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Without any further ado, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over. The first speaker for today is Linda.
Thanks, Samantha, and thanks to everyone for joining today. As Samantha said, my name is Linda Perry-Clear. I am a product line manager for Avality's provider line of business. Just before we kick off, I wanted to take a few minutes and give you a very brief overview of Avality. For those of you who may not know us, Avality is the nation's largest health information network. We facilitate over 4 billion clinical, administrative, and financial transactions each year. And we have a portfolio of products that leverage this network to improve the way payers and providers share information. Our solutions for providers include a multi-payer provider portal, an EDI clearinghouse solution, and our revenue cycle management tool. Our health plan portfolio also includes the portal, as well as our intelligent gateway offering and our clinical data exchange solutions. So because Avality sits at the intersection of payer and provider connectivity, we have a unique insight into how each side views the challenges of information sharing. One of the biggest challenges we face today is related to medical attachments. So most of you on this call today probably know the healthcare industry has been slow to adopt automated medical attachments, in large part because of a lack of a mandated industry standard. But we're also recognizing that we just can't wait anymore. If we want to reduce the cost and inefficiency of paper, we have to move forward and build out a solution that really streamlines the process. So as we look to our agenda, what brings us to the webinar today is that in recent months, Alice and I have been collaborating with stakeholders from both provider and payer organizations to build out a scalable model for implementing medical attachments. we're learning a lot from this work and really work to create a framework that we think any organization who's embarking on this type of initiative can benefit from. The framework really focuses on 3 areas. First is to identify provider value. And then second, establish the process. And then third, planning for scale and a broader enterprise clinical strategy. So using this framework, we've broken this webinar into 6 easy lessons that we're going to walk you through today. So moving on to the first slide, our first area of focus for us, value, and our first survey question. So today we're going to use a survey process to get that'll be interactive for the folks attending on the call. And we'd like you to start through this polling process, and we're going to ask you some questions. First question is really, how would you describe your organization's readiness to support the electronic claims attachments? And is that through, do you already have several programs or line of businesses that are currently live? Maybe you have 1 or 2 pilots that are already in progress. Maybe you're in the process of launching a pilot, or you may be conducting research, and it's very possible that it's not on your roadmap. So take a minute through the process and let us know exactly where you're at in your readiness to support the electronic claims attachments process. It looks like the responses that we're getting are that it's broken down, so we get to see this in real time, but looks like about divided through the top 3 are that you're currently live, 20-some% live, 20-some% are have 1 or 2 pilots that are in process, and then about 25% are still conducting research. Then others may be getting ready to launch a pilot, or it's 11% not even on the roadmap. So great information. Thanks for participating in the poll. So that moves us on to our first lesson. So as you see the results there, I love these interactive polls that we do in webinars. For most of us that participate in this webinar process, you sometimes may not feel as interactive, but these polls really help. So we look at lesson 1, where we talk about promoting the value of electronic attachments. So when we look at this, really, promoting the value of electronic attachments has to really speak to the provider's perspective so that you can get adoption. We look at the CAQH index numbers from 2017, where there were, we see that there is a significant savings for the provider community in adopting electronic attachments, along with health plans, but really being able to tell this story to the provider community so that you get buy-in from them about the process. Now note, in 2018, CAQH did not quantify savings for medical attachments, so the last data that we have is from 2017. But really promoting that value by first reducing, showing them how to reduce their administrative costs, fewer denials, a path to submit protected health information or PHI, and reducing the burden of physical storage is really key in showing the value for the provider. Second, when you look at how we're going to streamline the claims processing of attachments or claims that require medical attachments, you're talking about faster payment, easier ways to locate and submit information, and then being able to get better claim status monitoring. All of those things then lead to improved transparency and trust with the provider community. So these areas in which you use to promote the value really leads to that improved trust, breaks down the walls between health plans and providers. Providers feel like that health plans see and appreciate some of the administrative burdens that they have and are more willing to adopt these processes. All right, that takes us to lesson 2. And lesson 2 is all about KPIs. So when we think about establishing appropriate KPIs, really none of us embark on projects today without having KPIs that we can measure the success of what we're doing. We look at the unsolicited program ROI benefits that were reported by NGS in a webinar earlier this year. You'll see some of the KPIs that they measured was around receipt notification, delivery documentation, how long it took to process payments, denials, appeals, first-time claim submission, and then that last bullet, right, payer claim status calls being reduced. So when we think about KPIs, all of these KPIs align to the value that the provider sees to this process, reducing processing days, faster days to payment, and reducing the number of times they have to call health plans or that they have to touch a claim. So these KPIs align very well to the provider value. But then we look at our next point, which is then you have to assess the ability to measure results. So while these are great KPIs to measure, as you embark on this project and you think about adoption, you really have to assess what is your ability to measure results, meaning do you have the baseline data to start from today? Do you have the proper reporting tools? Can you track attachments in general? And can you quantify what resources are being dedicated within your organization to processing claims that require medical attachments? So that leads us to our last bullet point, and that is that in most cases, our work with provider groups, and I work mainly with providers in my role at Availity, is that most providers are unable to quantify this type of data on day one. And so as part of the process that we've implemented with bringing up providers and health plans in this process is establishing these KPIs, but many times we have to do that and accept day one as the baseline. So most, again, in my work with the provider groups, what we have seen is that I can go have conversations with providers and I'll be very straightforward and say, so tell me, how many claims did you process this week that required medical attachments? And can you tell me how long it's taking those claims to process? What is your success rate of getting those claims processed? And almost just across the board, it was that number could not be quantified. Now, what could be quantified was the FTE allocation that was out there for claims processing and how many FTEs were printing claims and mailing them. But the way that their PM, HIS systems or EHRs are set up, it's really because these claims are getting dropped into a group of all kinds of paper claims or other ways of submission, whether it's through an online portal or through fax, it's hard to isolate claim attachments and be able to call out processing days, true AR on these claims, and how many calls they're making on them. So in our work with the providers, we've encouraged them to do an exercise, whether it's a supervisor, a manager, or a director, and say, as you take one day, everything that gets printed on as a claim on your printer, and this works for not just claims attachments, but it's a great exercise across the board. Whatever you're printing, just leave it there for one day. And at the end of the day, go pick up all those claims or circulate through for these large shops and say, pull it all and aggregate it together and see how many claims are you really printing. And that gives you an idea. And sometimes you can use that as the baseline. So again, KPIs are really a big lesson that we learned. We all wanted to track them, but we really found that it was difficult many times to get to the data. So that takes us to the next area we want to focus on, and that's where we talk about process. So I hope you guys are there with your Jeopardy type buttons and ready to go, but we're going to do survey question 2, and that is, what do you anticipate will be the biggest challenge your organization faces as it prepares to implement an electronic attachment? So is it going to be provider adoption? Is it about the inability to track ROI on a project like this? Is it going to be resource constraints? Is it lack of mandated standards? Maybe it's just ensuring alignment within your back-end processes. So we'll give you a minute or two here as we're talking to get some votes in here. I'm starting to see some values come in here. It looks like lack of mandated standard, ensuring alignment with back-end processes is leading the pack. And then third is provider adoption. The ones coming in last there are resource constraints, timelines. Does look like lack of mandated standard and provider adoption is hand in hand there. So good information. So if we've got those responses, let's move on to our next lesson. So it's really interesting as we were seeing that the question was around provider adoption being something that you anticipate as a roadblock. I think this next lesson is really going to be key to helping you understand that. And it's about mapping out the provider attachment journey. So our first point here is that you have to identify all potential attachment workflows at a detailed level. So what is going to be key is that the whatever clearinghouse partners that you may work with, that they're able to implement a workflow across the providers that is consistent. What we have found in my experience in working with providers is that having different workflows for different health plans or different types of lines of business within that health plan will actually prevent adoption. So a provider from their perspective wants to see submitting attachments the same across the board. So when you look at it from the provider's perspective, it is they want to say that they submit attachments the same way across the board for any payer. And so when you look at that, just don't assume that the workflows on the health plan side is the same across all of your platforms or all of your lines of business. So you have to take that into consideration. The next area that we would focus on would be take into consideration the entire claims processing cycle. When you look at, is your process the same for professional claims, institutional claims? Don't limit your purview to just the attachment workflow. Really think of it in the context of a broader end-to-end processing of getting the claim adjudicated, right? There is a workflow just beyond the attachment. It was what happened to the claim prior to it being submitted that required the trigger to request medical documentation? Can you push editing up front in order to ask for the attachment up front? But if you do that, are your back-end systems ready to accept that? Taking a look at some of the things we saw in the process was that when we're killing a fax machine, was that the fax process required a specific form to be submitted in addition to the documentation. So on your back-end processing systems, what's going to take the place of that form? Are you still going to require the form? Because from a provider's perspective, still requiring the form that has to be filled out and sent in as an attachment may prevent adoption. Also, when you think about, don't forget to evaluate your back-end processes in your paper and then the documentation. And so when you think about that, really it's that you may have provider bulletins or billing guides that are out there that tell providers how to submit medical documentation. So you want to make sure that you update that once you launch an electronic process. So full-scale look at your documentation and education for your providers. What kind of workflows are they currently utilizing with you today? Thinking about how you're going to take that in on the back end. And then our third point here is really just assessing the impact of third-party vendors. And so when we've had experience with this is that think about, are there vendors downstream in your process that have requirements that need to be addressed? Is the attachment file too large for your third-party vendor? It may be fine for the health plan. There may be no restrictions for the health plan. But is there a third-party vendor that a health plan may send documentation to, and is there a restriction? Does your third-party, the clearinghouse partner in between, do they have restrictions? File naming conventions is another area that you'd want to look at. We've had some times, especially with third-party vendors, they have constraints around file naming conventions. But so I would just share with you that when you're looking at the provider's attachment journey and you worry about provider adoption, keep in mind that many providers today have been submitting electronic attachments or medical documentation for claims processing through electronic workers' comp processes for many years. As states have moved and required electronic submission of work comp claims, that has also required electronic attachments. So you'll find that many providers have processes in place that have automated attachments for those work comp claims. But really thinking about, how are you going to handle corrected claims? Do you want a corrected claim in addition to the attachment? Do you want just the attachment, no claim? And how will that be handled? So again, the provider journey is really key into getting this mapped out so that you can have success. So now I'll have Allison jump in and continue with lesson 4. Allison?
Thanks, Linda. Hi, everyone. My name again is Allison Loeb. I'm a product owner at Availity in our clinical data department. And as Linda mentioned, we've been working kind of as two sides of this project coordination over some time here to get our providers and health plans set up in this process. So, I'm going to take you through the last 3 lessons that we have here. All of the lessons and the points that Linda made in the first 3 sets of slides are really important takeaways before you go into lesson 4, which is picking a manageable starting point. You should have a really strong understanding and be able to articulate the value that this whole attachments process is going to bring, know exactly what metrics that the health plan needs to measure, how you're going to measure those, and then how this process is going to work before you pick your first pilot. It's probably not the best idea to pick a plan and then try to back into these details after the fact. So the whole world of electronic attachments has a lot of potential and excitement, a lot of opportunities for both the providers and the health plans. So you really do want to be careful when you're deciding on your first few paths to implementation. So in order to set yourself up for success, you definitely want to have a clearly defined scope. We've seen a lot of wins, Linda and I have, with some plans that were very thoughtful in starting small, remaining focused on the goals of that initial pilot. It's always a good idea to start with some providers that you have a positive working relationship with and are comfortable working collaboratively with throughout the process, because it will likely be a crawl, walk, run sort of situation. It may also be a great idea to start with either a smaller volume submitter, so you can really get an understanding of how all of the items that you've thought about and planned before actually, take shape once they're live, before you start turning on bigger or more high priority groups. Or if you do start with a high priority group, maybe it's just a small subset, 1 or 2 of their facilities or provider offices, to get the ball rolling. See how everything works, go back and assess before you kind of open up the floodgates to a wide scale approach. You may find that during your pilot, there'll be other stakeholders in your organizations that start to see the potential in the work that you're doing. May come to you with additional use cases, or we've really got to get this provider or organization signed up and they're eager to participate. That's awesome, and highly encourage you to take those ideas down, put them in a backlog, but really remain committed to the scope of that initial pilot. That way everyone that's participating knows where we are, knows where we're going, and doesn't feel like there's kind of this continual scope creep that they're never going to be done. So the second recommendation is to always openly communicate your roadmap as you're going through the pilot. Keep everyone that's involved, both directly involved in the pilot, and then any stakeholders that are keeping a close eye on things, up to date on where things are at, what you have left to do, any risks, roadblocks, the good and the bad, is to really help to establish more trust as you're going into slightly uncharted territory for your organization. This way, everyone will have a solid understanding of where you are in the process, and like I said, can help limit some of that frustration when it feels like this is a never-ending project that some group is going to be tied up with no real end in sight. So keeping an eye on the roadmap, knowing where you are, knowing what's left, is another really important thing that we've found throughout this journey. You also want to be sure to manage everyone's expectations. So based on everything that you've evaluated prior to getting into the pilot, and all of the understanding you have of your proposed attachments process, if you aren't expecting to implement a specific workflow or a line of business, if you don't plan to incorporate it into a specific area, be upfront with your providers about this when they ask. It's tempting to maybe conceal or sweep under the rug that you're thinking about something when you may know that that's really not something that's likely or deliverable in the near-term future, in hopes that you could one day resolve that. But it's important to try to remain as realistic as possible with what your organization can deliver. And in the end, your providers are going to appreciate the transparency that you had with them, and that sense of collaboration, and that they feel like they're in this journey with you. and that you weren't, misleading them along the way. So our last set of lessons deal with taking a successful pilot or a smaller group of implementations up to the enterprise scale. How do you roll this out from, 1 or 2 pilots to, your entire organization? So in lesson 5, we would definitely recommend to offer some flexibility to your providers, but to keep this within reason. You want to be able to understand and meet your providers where they are, but keep this at a manageable level. As we've mentioned a few times, there isn't a mandated standard right now for attachments, so it's going to be difficult, or you could meet some resistance if you say, this is the way we're doing it and everyone has to get on board. Some providers have different capabilities, different resource constraints, things like that. And through this work that Linda and I have been doing, we've encountered a whole variety of workflows, limitations, vendors, pretty much every combination of things you can imagine. So it's important to be flexible and keep this in mind when you're presenting your attachments offering. But at the same time, you don't want to accept just every single process that may come your way. So we would suggest having, a first or preferred path that if a provider has the technological capabilities, then great, everyone can kind of follow path A. But also knowing what your, a limited number of other alternatives or different options, channels, formats, things like that you would be willing to accept and will still work within your organization to get the process going. And this will help reduce some of the confusion and complexity that you will have to deal with internally. And it also gives the provider some options. So it's a little bit of a win-win for both sides without coming across too strong or being too wide open and having to work through all of the nuances of having, 10 or 12 different methods for accepting attachments. We'd also recommend having a solid plan for operations and support once you get this thing off the ground. Linda kind of touched on this earlier, but take inventory of all of the existing documents you have, anything that references the claims attachment submission process. What communication channels do you have? Any training resources that are already there? Do your current options have enough reach to properly communicate and spread the word about this great new endeavor you're going on? Are there guides that need to be updated? Do whole new guides need to be created? Will there need to be new programs or additional resources in certain areas in order to support your attachments process? And so be sure to engage any of those teams that are going to be affected and their resources so that they don't become a bottleneck when you are ready to go to that rollout and expansion phase. If they're part of the process along the way with you, you guys can be gearing up for this together and feel really solid and comfortable when the launch day is there. Another important area to talk about is reporting. We've hammered this a couple of times with KPIs, but we've seen some groups that felt pretty solid in their reporting capabilities. They thought about, daily attachments reports by, sender, by provider, kind of any cross-section that they could get. But when it came down to doing a report out, an executive level report out, once a month, we had one group that was still having to take all of the great reports that they did have and spend time doing manual intervention analysis in order to get it to a breakdown that they could do their report out to. So even though they have reporting tools and thought about reporting, they didn't quite take it to that next level in order to help themselves automate the ways that they could get to those actual KPIs without having to sink a bunch of expensive resources in time-consuming processes of, pouring through data dumps or large-scale reports for the past month or week or whatever interval of data you're looking at. So take a look at what tools you already have available. Is there another tool set that you may need to capture? Is there a vendor you could work with that would maybe would help you in this area? Or is this just a burden that you're going to have to accept and roll into and maybe figure out at a future state? And lastly, on this slide, we have you want to share all of your insights back with the providers. Having all this data is great, and will help within your organization to get more support and excitement going. but you don't want to leave your providers in the dark either. So be sure to share everything that you've gathered, all the lessons you've learned. This is only going to help further more participation and trust amongst your whole provider network. For those that are already participating, the data really shows them and solidifies that the investments that they made with you is paying off. Maybe some of them don't have as good of reporting on their side, so they may think that they're seeing benefits, but if you can help show them the data that look at the reduction in calls that we've had, look at how many days faster we're processing, it may really help some of those providers to feel like the time that they've spent with you doing this collaboration is worthwhile and will help them to, increase their participation in this area or even other areas. And then for the rest of your network that hasn't come on board yet, hearing about the successes of their peers may just be the tipping point that gets them to want to participate. We all know providers love data, they're facts driven. So if you can share this and spread it throughout the provider network, that could really help with some of those concerns about provider adoption that we saw in that poll earlier. And so our last lesson is all about taking the success that you see in the claims attachment world and thinking about how you can maybe roll this into a broader clinical data acquisition strategy within your organization. You'll likely find that within areas of your organization, there's other groups that could really benefit from this request response methodology. Areas such as auths and referrals, risk adjustment, quality reporting are all great examples. Linda mentioned the workers' comp is already doing similar things like that. So what other departments or groups within your organization are frequently reaching out to your provider network to get some kind of supporting clinical medical record, some kind of clinical documentation in order to complete their business processes? There's a huge amount of potential in this area, but with all that potential, there's also a bit of confusion that can come when you're trying to expand the attachments model outside of just the claims use. A lot of people know attachments as strictly claims, and so you may get some kind of puzzled looks or some interesting conversations in that area. But we do really recommend taking a look at your whole organization, identifying what other areas or programs are frequent requesters for clinical data or frequently need it. Take a look at the types of data they're requesting and see which would be a good fit, and start reaching out to some of those candidates to see, share with them your attachments journey, see if they're interested, start getting that feedback as you start to look throughout the rest of your enterprise. We do have a few health plans that we work with that are starting to have some of these conversations around expanding their attachments mindset. It's still largely uncharted territory for a lot of people, but if you keep the main idea in mind that on the side of your providers, it can be really confusing or frustrating for them to get all of these different types of notifications or outreach requests through all the different channels that we have: fax, email, phone calls, electronic portals, all sorts of ways that we're reaching out to them to make these what they view as the same sorts of requests. So, bringing some of that, difficulty onto your own shoulders, if you can find the path through it, will really help the providers from their eyes and improve the relationship you have with them if we can streamline the number of requests that we're making and the channels that we make those requests to them through. You should also be prepared to adopt and adapt to emerging technologies and new regulatory requirements. Once again, there isn't an adopter standard for attachments yet, so your strategy may work given what we know right now, but we don't really know exactly what the future holds. So it's important to keep this flexibility in mind. And in today's healthcare climate, we're seeing new rules, guidelines, and regulations being introduced all the time. I'm sure many of you have heard some of the buzz around FHIR within the industry, and it's kind of gaining steam and looking like it may become a new industry standard for how to exchange data. We've also seen this year the ONC has released 2 drafts of TEFCA, which is aimed at achieving nationwide interoperability and making this easier. It seems like within recent years, the whole entire health community has been looking for new, different ways to make the sharing of data easier and more efficient. We started kind of provider to provider, and now it's really expanding into that provider to payer sharing to make that simpler, quicker to implement, faster to do, easier to sustain and operate. Making sure your organization is aware of these conversations and these new ideas that are coming up, and slightly directionally aligned with the way that this, the healthcare environment appears to be moving. Are there ways that you can look at the strategy you have today that does work and maybe integrate some of these new models, plug them in, or do you have a framework that's pretty rigid? If you do, it may be something that you want to address sooner than later. There's really no such thing as future-proofing, but if you're aware of these new models that are coming out, and already starting to have the research and discovery conversations, both within your organization, possibly with other, with other vendors or other people that may be able to help you with achieving that, it'll really help set you up for success so that you're not responding to something when it becomes a law or a mandate that you weren't really considering before the fact. And then lastly, our final recommendation is to recognize that this is going to be an iterative process. I think we can probably all agree from past experience with other initiatives that once you roll out a strategy, your work is never really done. So we encourage you to keep looking for opportunities to improve the overall process, both just within your claims attachment world, and then as you expand it out beyond that into the rest of the enterprise, constantly gathering feedback, looking for ways to incorporate some of that, improve it. Are there ways you can improve your internal processes, your data centralization? So maybe some of those groups that are making requests all the time don't have to make their own requests, but they can simply go in-house and look at the stores, the multitude of data that you already have. If you've got a medical record that you got at the time of the claim, and then, later down in the year, it's you're looking for a value for HEDIS or quality reporting, and you've got that lab value already in a medical record. Are there ways you can tap into that a little bit better so that we're not constantly making the same ping to our providers over and over again? So always being aware that once you have a strategy in mind, it may work for a time being, but being open to constantly refining, looking for ways to make it better and to improve it, and iterating on the model that you do have is a really important mindset to have, to understand, and to embrace. This change is always going to be there, whether we want it to be or not. So with that, I think we will open it up to questions now.
Yeah, and I think, so as Allison shared, I think our perspective on this project would be, as you guys are submitting some questions, if you want to use the chat window, that's usually a very easy way to get your questions in, so you don't feel like you might be speaking over someone. But it's a very doable project and process, and the providers that we have worked with have been eager to adopt it and have seen a lot of benefits from it. So I think that's one thing I would share, is that it's a very exciting project because providers are very anxious and excited about doing it. And then I think the health plans we worked with have been excited to bring this into some of their initiatives to reduce administrative costs. So it's just been very exciting time. It's very challenging too. I think the keys have been these extensive workflow walkthroughs, making sure that you thought about things well. And of course, both Allison and I, we've taken a few lumps in the process and learned some lessons. So we're happy to share those. So I don't know if we're getting any questions in.
We've got one we can go ahead and talk about. Are clients able to reduce the number of people they have managing, entering, scanning attachments? If I were to pitch this to my team, can you give me any advice on how I could quantify the impact on staffing?
Yeah, I mean, so from a provider perspective on staffing, I can speak to that, and then Allison maybe can speak to it from a health plan perspective. So from a provider perspective, what we're seeing is that from Availity's perspective, we've launched an all-payer solution at which that even if a health plan is not able to take an attachment electronically, that we will print and mail it on their behalf. So providers are seeing that. We are seeing some reduction in FTE time. I would say that this is still in its infancy. So I would say what we're finding is that they're able to reallocate staff. Again, the KPI measure is a little bit challenging, but what we see is that they are eager to adopt. They are very excited about the transparency it brings, and we think that will lead to FTE reduction.
Yeah, and I would echo that on the payer side. We're definitely seeing where it's easier for the teams that are responsible for this to work more efficiently. There's still going to be a team in place that needs to, pull in the attachments and, complete the claims process for them, but that they're getting a large amount of their attachments through the same channel. They can go to the same place within, their organization, working with us to kind of figure out, can we deliver this to them via EDI? Is it via an FFPP? Are there specific file formats they need? But then it can go into their native systems and flow with the rest of their downstream processes. So they're not having to work as many different ways of looking at all of these attachments. They don't have as many variations. So it's easier and more efficient to get the work done, which ultimately, would return with, fewer FTEs needed to do the work, when it's simpler to stay in one or two workflows and get through your whole queue versus constantly having to, dart around to different ones, making a bunch of phone calls, checking the fax machine, things like that. The more you can have a greater number of providers in the same channel will definitely improve your efficiency and output in processing.
I would share one other part just around that question was, I do expect that we will start to see more and more efficiency gains by providers based on some work that we've done with provider groups that are using, and I'll speak to provider groups that are using Epic as their HIS or EHR system because the way our model works is we've accounted for that to be an integrated workflow for the providers. So they do all of the work of submission of those attachments through our revenue cycle management product in an integrated fashion. And Epic has built out ROI, they call ROI, the rules that can, if they receive a certain request for a certain type of claim, they could build out rules that would say, then always send, for example, this H&P or send this op note or send this ER record. So they've been able to do some automation. Providers that use Epic have been able to do some automation around even picking which attachment gets pulled. And I think that's where we will really start to see the efficiency is when they can start using some of that technology that they have in place to even further pick and pull the attachment that's needed in an automated way. And it looks like there was a question about what was the name of that in Epic, and they call it ROI, so using ROI rules. So ROI, which in finance world, you think of return on investment, but in the Epic world, it's a rules engine that drives automation. So are we getting more questions maybe?
Yep, we've got another one. What's a good way to get clearinghouses on board?
Okay, well, Alice, I can take a stab at that, and then you jump in if you want.
Sure.
So I would just say a clearinghouse partner that is in tune with their provider needs is probably already looking at this. And the way that I would say that is, now given the fact I work on the revenue cycle management tool and in the provider world, I still find what we call RCM very exciting. But we have really squeezed a lot of juice out of the basic EDI transactions. So it really shouldn't be that difficult for a clearinghouse to get on board, especially if they've already been doing work comp claims processing. Again, I mentioned earlier, providers have been submitting attachments with work comp claims electronically for many years. I've worked with provider groups directly for their setup and submission of attachments for work comp claims. So if a clearinghouse was already able to process work comp claims, even over through an additional third party, they're probably not that far away from doing attachments for medical claims. So I really don't think there's that much you have to do to get them on board for that. Allison, I don't know what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, we already have, in the kind of the rest of the Availity world that we deal with, we are a clearinghouse and we have relationships with other clearinghouses. So we've had provider groups come to the table, with a payer interested that uses a Change or uses Optum or uses Japari, whatever clearinghouse. And we as another vendor are always happy to work with another clearinghouse. It does not have to be directly to the provider office themselves for them to figure out, or the provider network, how to figure out this whole attachments thing. So for those that already have, that are connected to clearinghouses, and you're looking for, maybe that clearinghouse isn't connected to your payer, or you need another intermediary. I think my experience has been a lot of them are open to, willing to understand that we all will work together to get these attachments where they need to go. We have a few pilots in place where some of the providers do use the clearinghouse, and that's how we're making the connection. For us at Availity, it's great because we already have connections to them in for other use cases, so we can utilize that same connectivity pipeline and just start adding attachments to it as well, and then handle all of the routing and any other payer specific edits or upgrades or things like that they need to do within our four walls, so that they don't have to try to renegotiate with that clearinghouse something that they may need that's slightly custom or not quite the industry standard or what you see across the board. So I think there's definitely a lot of potential, and the clearinghouses will become a major player in this as well, and we're always happy to work with them because we realize that that's what the providers utilize. So however we can make the process work, always open and willing to do so.
I would say one other thing that came to mind as we were talking about that is that from a clearinghouse perspective, they need to be able to be flexible to a provider's workflow. Again, from my perspective with our revenue cycle management tool, it's about being able to handle from the provider's perspective. It appears as one workflow. The clearinghouse then simplifies that out to the health plan in a standardized 275 transaction, whereas from a clearinghouse, Allison hit on her presentation and speaking more towards the being flexible, but also having a plan laid out. I think it's the same for clearinghouses that are working with providers. Most of those guys are going to submit PDFs. So you have to be able to facilitate a workflow for them that allows them to submit those PDFs, and then as a clearinghouse being able to take that PDF and send it over to the health plan in a standardized format. There's also those, they try and send stuff as JPEGs and TIFFs, and there are some that would send a 275 in, but even when you look at, for example, like Epic, and I mention them because they're a significant part of the market share, right, for providers, the system that providers use. They can produce a 275, but they can only do very limited documentation in the 275. Again, right now, the majority of that's PDF. So I would say being able to handle the PDF workflow is going to be critical in adoption for a clearinghouse to then be able to take that and get it outbound to a health plan in a standardized way. A great question. I don't know if we got any more in. Just have to say Alice and I love this, so we can talk about this all day.
We haven't had any other questions come in, but if y'all would like to wrap up with any comments or additional words of wisdom you'd like to impart.
Allison, you want to start, and then I'll wrap up too?
Sure. I would say, just in terms of words of wisdom, and Linda kind of mentioned this. This is a very doable, achievable process. There are definitely challenges. So for those of you that said you're still researching or considering this, I would really encourage you to invest the time to finish out your research and take those steps to picking a pilot. There's a lot less risk in starting with a pilot, understanding that everyone in your organization that you've done the research, you have the idea, and you want to see how it works in a real world situation. Those that are willing to take the leap have seen a lot of great results. We're always happy to help in that technology standpoint of how you can make this happen. If maybe you have ideas and you don't know if they're feasible or not, Linda and myself and our teams are more than willing to entertain or have calls with people. But I would really encourage you just to finish out that research and see what your next step is, instead of spending all this too much time thinking that this is just this insurmountable task and it's a huge mountain to climb. Chunk it out, start somewhere, and I can always guarantee that you'll start seeing results. And then from there, you can really see how to grow it, how to expand it, and how to benefit from it. So I would just encourage those that are kind of on the fence or are still struggling in that research phase, that this is a doable, achievable thing that we've seen happen kind of before our very eyes. So just some words of encouragement there.
Yeah, that's great, Allison, and I would agree. It's that crawl, walk, run mentality. We've got to start somewhere to get rid of these fax machines, right? Providers don't like them. Health plans don't like them. I will tell you, patients don't like them. When you're trying to figure out how do my medical documentation get to my health plan so they can adjudicate my claim as a patient, and I don't worry about what's going on. I can focus on my health. I mean, if we take it down to a very basic level, it's all about our patients, whether we're helping providers do what they do, we're helping health plans do what they do. At the bottom line, it's really just about these patients and how the process works, and getting more efficient so that things are easier for them. I mean, it is kind of maybe hokey and you think about that, but when you boil it down, it's there. I think the crawl, walk, run mentality, it's very doable. I would just, like Allison said, I would encourage you. Providers are hungry for this workflow. We have not talked to any provider who it's not first on their list of something that they want to talk about. If you can help them bring efficiency to this process and even just transparency to it, they're open to the first being transparency, next being a lot of efficiencies. So we just encourage you. It's a great project. We love working on it, but and we're very excited about what's going on here. So again, we're open to helping you guys answer questions or just talk through things. So we really appreciate you joining today and listening to the discussion.
Thank you so much. We've got another question come in, and since we have a few minutes left, I thought I would make sure y'all could address this for everybody. Okay. Our attendee is looking for storage strategies, length of time, grievances, appeals, audits, suggested length of time for storage.
Yeah, Allison, you want to take that from a health plan perspective, and then I can take it from a provider? Or?
Sure. So from a health plan perspective, we can work with whatever regulations or whatever rules you have within your organization as to what your storage needs to be. Our kind of recommended storage strategy is 2 years of what we call our easily accessible data, and then I believe it's either 7 or 9 years of long-term, which is less accessible, but it's still there if you should need it. So usually we find that most of the work is I mean, not truly under a year or less, but having that 2-year kind of easily accessible storage, it seems to work for many health plans, and they're comfortable with that. And then knowing that they have that long-term retention option as well. We can increase that, us at Availity can, and I'm sure other vendors could work with that as well. Each one may have some limitations or different, contracting items that may come into play with that. But we see that two-year kind of easily accessible model with a lot of our plans with a longer-term retention after that.
And I would agree. It's very similar from a provider's perspective. Is that in our revenue cycle management tool, making things visible for easily and viewable for 24 months, 2 years, and then accessible for 7 years seems to be the norm of what we've gone through. Great question. All right, I think. Samantha, I think that wraps us up for the day. So we appreciate you guys hosting. And again, it was great talking with folks today.
Yep, thanks for a great webinar. And I'll be following up with all of our attendees with the slide deck and the link to the recorded webinar. Thanks again. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their week.